Hello, friends. Welcome to our new feature on the Daily Planet, So-Called Writers, the show where Michael and I write fiction and talk about it.
That's right, Matt. The rules are simple. Rule 1, we generate 3 random nouns on a random word generator. Rule 2, we spend exactly 30 minutes writing a short story that prominently features those 3 words. And then 3, we discuss the stories we wrote and try to learn something from the experience.
Yeah, and if we get a lot of participation from listeners, we may tweak the format to accommodate listener submissions and guests. But as of now, this is what we're doing. Welcome to the podcast. Today's 3 words are employee, gland, minute. So in a little bit, we're going to get to those stories and the discussion. Michael, let's just talk everyone through kind of the genesis of why we're doing this exactly and why we thought this was a good idea. You want to explain the background of the So-Called Writers Project, maybe?
Right. Well, this is a project we started back in grad school. And I actually don't remember exactly when we started it. Was it after you moved away from College Station, or was it just before?
I'm close. I think it may have been after I left, actually, yeah.
Sometime around then. But basically, Matt and I used to both be graduate students at Texas A&M University. And then he left, and sort of as both a way to stay in touch with each other and to work on our writing craft, because we used to write a lot together. We came up with this So-Called Writers Project where we had a private blog, and we had these a certain number of stories we had to write every week, and then the other person would read it and comment on it. And all these short stories generated a lot of cool ideas and discussion, and actually a couple projects have spawned from some of these stories.
Yeah, it was a really good way to cultivate the habit of writing frequently, which, every experienced, published writer is like, the main thing is to just write frequently and every day if possible. And right. Kind of go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's just a super low barrier to write a little short story. There's not a lot of pressure to make it really good. You're just kind of getting an idea out.
Yeah, and that was one thing that we always had, and I think is very common, is like a sense of like, all right, well, if I'm going to write, I got to get my special writing notebook and my special writing pen and go to that particular spot where I write and make sure that everything is just right. Yeah.
Plan out the whole novel, the whole series of novels in some cases.
Yeah.
And never actually write anything.
Right. So this project was directly aimed at countering that tendency to just be like, no, you can really write like, and that's kind of what we learned is like, oh, you can write like on the bus on your phone, and it can actually come out really well if you just get into the habit of doing it. And also another cool thing I like about this project, and I'm hoping that this will kind of port over to this iteration, is it really kind of primes the story idea pump. Like when we were really doing that project in earnest, I would have like 5 story ideas a day, and I would note down all of them, and only some of them would end up being put into the into the blog. But like that's the thing, is when you're like your brain kind of responds to demands, your subconscious does anyway, so it kind of throws you more story ideas when you're in a place where you're receptive to them.
Yeah, the more you write, the more you think about writing. And another thing about this, and this wasn't the original rules of the So-Called Writers Project, but it is something we've done before, and that's the 3-word game, where you have to write a story about 3 words. And the cool thing about that, and I think anyone who kind of looks at this, the rules of this project beforehand, kind of has the same response to it, but like you kind of immediately envisage something, like your mind goes somewhere with the 3 words right away. And the limitations of having to use these 3 words really gives you loads of ideas that you wouldn't normally have.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll talk specifically about how that works when we get to the actual prompt this week. But yeah, that's absolutely true. As you're fond of saying, limitations breed creativity, and that's certainly an example of that here.
Yes, that's a quote by Mark Rosewater, a Magic the Gathering designer, for those in the audience who might be familiar. Or he might have quoted someone else, but that's where I heard it from.
That's cool. Yeah, and I mean, and then like I guess kind of the final point of all this is to get better at writing and understand writing better, because when you do this kind of frequently and iteratively, you have a chance to look at what you did and say like, okay, this is what I was trying to do, but I missed the mark maybe, or like, oh, I like this thing that I managed to do here. Let me think about that.
Right.
And
And sometimes and discussing it with another person helps you identify things that you've been doing that you didn't quite realize why you were doing them.
mhm.
And that's also very useful just to kind of make some of these things explicit instead of just habits.
Yeah, right. It's and like since it's a low investment thing, it's 30 minutes. Like everyone knows, that it's not going to be a masterpiece. Like there's no like expectation of like, oh, this should be really excellent,
Right.
because it's 30 minutes and it's a first draft, and you probably didn't have much time to think about it in advance. So there's a lot less ego invested in it. Like you feel less vulnerable sharing it because you're like, look,
Yeah.
everyone understands that this isn't my best work. Let's just see what we can learn from it anyway.
I definitely suffer from that for most of the things I write, where I don't want to do anything with it until it's perfect, and thus it just sits there.
Yeah, right. So that's anyway. Those are all of the things that we have accomplished in the past using a similar thing with our private blog, in which we're hoping to not only accomplish for ourselves here, but for anyone who wants to participate with us. We're glad to have you, and again, we'll find some way of involving the audience.
Yeah, there were two responses on the Reddit thread that you created of people who had joined in, which was pretty cool to see since we haven't even released this podcast yet.
Yeah, that's right. We created a subreddit r/so-called writers, and I'm going to be posting a thread for each prompt. And we already got, like Michael said, we already got submissions. So, and I think at the end we will talk a little bit about those. We're really thrilled to see that. All right, so I guess before we get into the stories, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of your first impressions of the employee Gland minute theme?
Yeah. So for me, like the things that really jumped out were employee and minute as a sort of like employee, like watching a clock tick and his life being pointless. And then the gland was more of an evolved, a more specifying word for my story, rather than a main idea. And I think that it was kind of the opposite for you. I feel like Gland was maybe a major motivator in your story.
Yeah. It's funny. I was trying to go back through and like retrace how exactly things spawned, but yeah, I think Gland was what struck me first because that sort of defined the motivating incident, and employee and minute are almost just like details that are secondary to that. But we'll get into that. But yeah, it's really interesting how like you mentioned earlier, your brain immediately kind of renders like a set of possibilities from those words.
Yeah. And the employee, the kind of a dystopian sort of employee who has kind of a pointless job, sort of imagery came to my head, and that's where I went with it.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go ahead and you won the coin flip, so let's go ahead and read your story. So go ahead, Michael.
The minute hand struck 4. The employee sunk back in his chair. The kiosk windows were safely shut, the papers overflowing in the bin. Sounds of Joe Soma's voice cut through the static of the lo-fi speakers. That's crazy. That's crazy. You can't just do that. Sam Sebo responded emotively. I know, it's crazy. It's crazy, Joe agreed. The employee listened vicariously to the conversation. He chuckled to himself. That Joe, he's crazy. The minute hand struck 5. The door chime rang. The employee sat up in his chair and gulped nervously. A woman under a hat approached the kiosk window. The employee's right hand hovered anxiously above the lever. Beads of sweat formed on his brow. He wiped them away with the handkerchief in his left. It wasn't his fault. He had a glandular condition. The woman under the hat looked at the building schematics taped to the kiosk windows. The employee looked down and rested his hand atop the lever. The employee looked up. The woman under the hat was walking up the stairs. The employee sunk back in his chair and wiped the sweat from his brow. He had a glandular condition. The minute hand struck 6. The employee listened vicariously to the pleasing lo-fi crackle of Joe Soma. Ha ha, that Joe. The clock struck 7. The employee grabbed a piece of paper from the bin. What is the voltage? The employee scanned the LED panel with his eyes. The voltage is 4. The employee wrote 4 on the paper and dropped it down the chute. He sunk back in his chair and sighed, pleased with himself. The minute hand struck 3. Joe Soma was conversing passionately with Sam Sebo. You can't do that. You can't. Sam Sebo wholeheartedly agreed. No, you can't do that. You really can't. The door chime rang. The employee held his breath as a man behind goggles approached the kiosk window. His sweaty hand hovered over the lever. I have a glandular condition, he explained in his mind. The man behind goggles scanned the kiosk, confused. The employee pushed the lever, only slightly. The kiosk window cracked open, tiny sliver. The man behind the goggles jumped back and turned to ascend the stairs, 2 at a time. The employee sighed in relief and wiped his brow. The minute hand struck 4.
Awesome. Cool. All right. So the way I think we should maybe handle the discussion of stories, and this is a vague outline, but like I'll talk about kind of my thoughts, and then you can interject and correct. And the reason I suggest that is like if you open up talking about your own story, then I'm like primed on like what you were trying to say.
Right.
And there's like you learn less because if my impression is totally wrong, you might still learn something useful. So
right.
So yeah. So first of all, my interpretation of this story is that this is your interpretation of what my life is like. Basically, just listening to Joe Rogan in order to feel like a human while mechanically executing menial tasks that a computer could probably do, while avoiding human contact and staring at the clock. I mean, I'm half joking when I say that you were trying to describe me specifically, but yeah, I think this is a vignette of the life of like a corporate employee in like a soulless dead end job doing some mechanical task and exaggerated in like what strikes me as an almost like Terry Gilliam style. Maybe I just say that because we just watched 12 Monkeys.
No, it's funny you say that because that's like, I think I was directly motivated by 12 Monkeys and I kind of imagined a similar world. And maybe it was, I'm not sure exactly what made you catch that. Like maybe it was the woman under a hat sort of idea or the man behind goggles or something like that.
I think it was probably a lot to do with just like it's almost like the alienation and like separation between people and the fact that instead of just having the kiosk door open, like it just seems like a totally Terry Gilliam thing to have like the guy's sitting there and his job is presumably to like talk to these people, but he just has the door shut all the time.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's so yeah, you're pretty spot on with your analysis there. I wasn't thinking of you, but it's kind of like my worst nightmare of like what my job would be, and also kind of like a reflecting into the future, because I've started listening to a couple podcasts recently, not I wouldn't say like habitually and not at work or anything, but I kind of feel guilty for doing it because I kind of feel like I'm vicariously having a conversation through other people when I should just be talking to other people to fill that desire. So this is kind of an extrapolation of that, of like a future where no one really talks to each other anymore because it's too like socially awkward. Just like it's like too socially awkward to call someone on the telephone even anymore. Like it's like, oh, what are you doing? Just send a text.
Yeah, you're
You're being way too invasive right now. And this is an extrapolation of that. Where it's like, what are you doing talking to someone? Like you need to be a little bit more indirect about that. And yeah, the Joe Rogan thing was a reference.
Yeah, I thought that was funny because I immediately got like Joe and of course Soma. I mean, maybe not everyone is aware that's like the reference to the drug that's just basically supposed to keep people complacent. So basically, calling basically directly equating podcasts to a sort of stupefying drug.
Right,
which
yeah.
is ironic because of the medium that we're delivering this
exactly,
discussion in. But
right.
Yeah. So yeah, other things I noticed, you're using this motif of each of the people entering the building is defined as being behind or under some part of their attire. So there's like an extra degree of separation on top of like the kiosk. Everyone is separating themselves from everyone else. and this is emphasized when the man behind the goggles flinches away from the employee when he thinks the employee is going to try to talk to him. So it's like kind of like you just said,
Right.
it clarifies that this is like it's not actually just the employee character who has this
Exactly. Yeah.
aversion. It's like this whole world.
Yeah, I did that very purposefully for the reason you said, just so you know it's not about the employee character, and and yeah, with the descriptions of the people not using any names, that was an explicit attempt to dehumanize them a little bit.
Yeah, so that's cool. So I guess I would say, was there anything you were trying to get across that I did not mention, or that you just feel like maybe you didn't get across?
Well, reading it out loud, I kind of didn't really like the way it sounded. I was trying to be like really terse with the sentences, really terse and repetitive with the sentences to kind of get a communicate the kind of repetitiveness of the job and the kind of like non-floweriness of the job, or the plainness of the job, or something like that. But reading it out loud, I didn't really feel like that came across so much as it just being like really blandly written,
Okay.
or really it's kind of jarring almost.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, one thing is I wasn't sure, like the minute hand is striking numbers out of sequence, so I wasn't sure if that was indicating like these are stories happening over multiple hours, or what exactly the meaning
Yeah,
of that was.
yeah. So that was just sort of an exercise in not knowing where I was going with it exactly. It was just kind of I wanted it to end the same way it began, just to kind of show that this is sort of a pointless cycle. And so it starts with the same number it ends on. And I did, and the time I had it jump back was when he puts the piece of paper in the machine. So that was just sort of an ambiguous thing that you could interpret as like maybe when he fills out one of the pieces of paper, like it gives him more time or something. Like maybe that's some kind of currency in a sort of what was the short story that was the movie In Time with
Yeah,
just anyway, that was I think a Harlan Ellison short story that's sort of a similar
cool.
idea to that. So I didn't really have anything in mind with it. I was just like the clock was central to was one of the hints was one of the three words, minute.
Yeah,
And so I was just using the clock to sort of show that time was really slowly passing, and then like it would all happen over again.
yeah, that definitely like I find it surprisingly valuable. Like when I'm trying to like grope towards something that I haven't even quite clarified in my own mind, and then you can kind of surprise yourself when you do that. So yeah,
Right.
I tend to definitely do that where I'm like I include an element and it's almost like you're shaping it in place. You don't quite know what it's going to be yet.
Right. And the way I wrote this is I didn't think about this very much before I wrote it at all. My kind of strategy on this was to just isolate the writing experience to like when I went to go write. So basically, I thought about it a little bit on my sort of car ride to the cafe where I wrote this, which was like 5 minutes. And then I sat down, started the timer, and then I spent like another few minutes writing, thinking about what I was going to say. But then I started writing it before I knew like how anything was going to end. So the clock thing was just one of the ideas that never really finished into something that I completely thought through.
Okay.
But I find that if you just start a story, like you kind of can think of ways that it can go, and sometimes it turns out well, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, that's cool. So yeah, I mean, we didn't really clarify the rules in terms of like how much like thinking time is allowed, and I think that's actually completely fine because I think different prompts and different like you might be in a different place where it's like you have some time and you actually want to think through it for a while, and like that's kind of where I was this week is I had a few periods of time where I was able to think about the prompt, and so I actually had I kind of whittled away and iterated a couple times on kind of what I was thinking before I even sat down. And then when I did sit down, I kind of went through all of the like points I wanted to hit and made sure that I had them all straight in my head. So I actually had it quite straight in my head before I started writing.
Did you get to the end of your story that you'd planned, or?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, honestly, I mean, if we're gonna be super strict, I think I was writing the last sentence as my timer went off.
I think that's an acceptable
Yeah,
acceptable
I
interpretation. Yeah.
I didn't feel too bad about it because I was like, and yeah, I mean, like I don't like to be too painfully strict about about the idea. It's really
No,
just
no,
yeah,
it's not meant to be like a heavily rules lawyered game. It's a an outline to make us write better.
right, right. All right, so yeah, I'll move on and I'll read my story now. You'll have 1 minute, said the doctor. He set the styrofoam cooler on the bench beside Megan deliberately and started to wiggle on a pair of fresh latex gloves. Natasha would have folded her arms, but they were already folded. You can still back out of this, Meg, she said. Megan ignored her. How will I know it's working? She asked the doctor. Oh, you'll know, the doctor said. He lifted the lid on the cooler and withdrew a small medical waste-looking baggie from the ice. You know what an adrenaline rush feels like, I would assume. Megan nodded impatiently, rechecked the bindings on her gloves, nervously rolled out her shoulders. Yeah, in the octagon I'll already be experiencing an adrenaline rush. Well, this will feel like an adrenaline rush feels, except much more so. Your heart rate will increase, your muscles will be stronger, but you'll think faster, you'll be more clear-headed, sharper. You'll also perceive that your breathing gets easier, but this has more to do with capillary dilation than anything. This will feel like the difference between normal you and you having an adrenaline rush, except you'll feel it on top of the rush of the fight. Natasha interjected. And you know all this how? The doctor glanced at her. I've performed this procedure on over 100 military volunteers and taken detailed data on its effects. Give it a rest, Natty, Meg said flatly. Help hold me down. This was going to happen. So stubborn. Natasha had a sick feeling that rose up from her stomach to her throat. She was very nearly in fight-or-flight mode herself. She had tried everything she could think of to dissuade her sister from this course, but Megan had made up her mind. Megan knew, believed, whatever, that she wasn't good enough to beat Sarah Strickland in a fair fight, and Megan had to beat her. When this doctor made contact through an appropriately shady back channel, the choice had been easy for her. Natasha had told her not to. In this context, though, Natasha wasn't Megan's sister. She was just her trainer, her employee. Trainer, sister, or whatever else. Megan was Megan, and Megan didn't listen to anybody but Megan. The doctor drew the gland out of the baggie with an elaborate mechanical contraption, snake-like and jointed. It was moderately prehensile and had a grass spur on one end, which was presently holding the dark gray, veined, vaguely furry lump of tissue. The doctor looked at Megan very seriously as she tried to push herself back onto the bench, awkwardly grasping the backrest with her gloved fingers. Again, 1 minute. Onset will start about 10 minutes after I introduce it into your body. Are you ready? USADA won't be able to find a trace of it? Megan asked for at least the 5th time. The idea here is that the gland filters out all the chemicals it introduces. By the time you step out of the ring, you'll be clear to pass any conceivable blood test. The gland itself will be digested before you go to bed tonight. Megan looked at Natasha, who gave her no reassurance, but dutifully placed her hands on Megan's shoulders to pin her against the bench. Megan swallowed. Do it. The doctor leaned forward. This won't be pleasant. I'll try to be quick about it. I've had worse. Megan opened her mouth, and the doctor shoved the snake tool down her throat. At the end of the second round, Megan limped to her corner, and Natasha threw a cold towel around her shoulders. Reggie wiped her face down while Natasha talked to her. She's trying to take you to the ground. She's trying to bait you into making a head kick while she dips down like that. She's trying to set up a sweep. Reggie squirted water into Megan's mouth. She swished and spit it into the waiting bucket. I know, Megan said. I got this. Don't worry about it. She was holding eye contact with Natasha and gave a slight nod. The drugs are kicking in. Megan stood and entered the ring, and when the bell rang, she attacked like an animal. Her punches were precise, fast, and ruinously hard. The first 2 jabs set Strickland on her heels, and the third hit, a right hook, sent her stumbling back 2 paces. Megan followed up with a flurry that people would be dissecting on the instant replay for years to come. Strickland was rocked, but Natasha saw it all play out a slow second before it happened. The woman dipped down and fainted, and Megan sprung a nasty roundhouse kick aimed at her head, but Strickland weaved around it as it came and swept Megan's planted foot out from under her. Once on the ground, in Strickland's wheelhouse, Megan found herself dominated and choked out in a handful of seconds. Megan didn't listen. Natasha looked at her coldly. In the locker room, Megan was wiping a smear of blood from the corner of her eye. I'll do better next time, Megan said. I know what it's like now. She won't catch me with that trick again. Call the doctor, Natty. Tell him to get another batch ready.
Okay, yeah. So the first thing that I um, noticed, or starting from the beginning of your story, that is I think, a cool thing to point out is your technique of kind of being thrust directly into the middle of a scene that's already occurring, um, through just like someone speaking some line of dialogue that's not completely explained, and using that as a way to make the reader interested in the story right away, and then you kind of go on to explain it, um, in the next few paragraphs, or the next paragraph or so. So it's not like you're hiding the truth throughout the whole story, but you're just kind of putting someone directly in the middle of it, making them kind of ask a question and then like want to read further.
Yeah, I was hoping that I kind of pulled that off, because sometimes when I try that kind of cold open technique, it you don't quite fully get what the scene is until it's kind of too late, and then you have to like double back and read it again. So I was hoping that it just kind of flowed.
Yeah, I think it worked really well here. I think it works maybe to generalize the technique a little bit. Um, Maybe it works when the point isn't like an action that's going on in the scene, because that can be confusing, but just like a situation that's being talked about, like you're doing, tends to work well, because you can just provide the information shortly after, and you don't have to like describe like all of the movements everyone was doing and stuff like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because, like you said, everyone in the scene is stationary, so there's not like
Right.
the scene is not evolving as it's being described.
Right. The whole story really, I mean, the fight happens at the end, but I would say like the meat of the story is kind of the character development in your previous chapter, which is really just like how these characters are responding to the implanting of this cheating gland in Megan.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Definitely, most of the words are in the part where they're discussing putting in the gland. The fight and the aftermath of the fight are very short relatively to that. So yeah.
Yeah, and you also characterize everyone pretty quickly. So unlike my story where I like purposefully didn't characterize anyone, um, you very rapidly and effectively characterize Natasha as someone who disapproves of the situation, but cares about her sister. And I think Natasha is also Megan's trainer, if I
Right.
interpreted that. Yeah,
Right.
and then Megan is quickly um, characterized as someone who just has this like laser focus on winning this fight at any cost. Like her only question is, like, am I going to get caught if I use this? And seems to have quite a bit of confidence that if she uses this, then she'll have the edge to win. Um, there's a cool exact wording you use here. Natalie had warned her not to, but she knew dash believed dash whatever she could win. Like she doesn't even care why. You know, like she doesn't even like think about like how she could train better or what she could do to win. She's just like, oh, this thing will make me win, and I have to beat this person because I'm very competitive.
Yeah. So kind of what was going on in my mind there, and maybe this is something that kind of comes across, was that Megan is actually more like averse to losing than she is concerned about winning. And like kind of the other half of this that I didn't really telegraph, but I think it's there like to be found if someone wants to analyze, which is an interesting thing that I don't normally do consciously. Is that like while Natasha is sternly disapproving and like glaring, she's also just like completely complicit and helping and not doing anything to stop it. She's not threatening to leave the team or whatever
Right.
if Megan goes through with it.
She's kind of the uh, Ron Weasley, maybe, or like the the sidekick character who's always like, oh, I don't know if we should do this, but
Yeah.
like doesn't actually like take any initiative into stopping the thing that the
Right.
protagonist wants to do.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's if anything, it's a story where nothing changes, because you don't get the impression at the end that Natasha's going to be like, no, because like no one has learned anything basically,
Right.
including Natasha.
Right.
So
Yeah, and that kind of ties up nicely with the fact that it's clear that Megan hasn't thought about this fight in a in a way other than, can I use this thing to win? And she's not listening to her sister at all, who's like told her what she should do, what she should avoid in the fight. And, Megan ignores her and then loses. And then, yeah, the great last line or next to last line or whatever, where it just shows that she still hasn't learned her lesson. Like she's just gonna do the exact same thing next time, and
Yeah.
it'll probably work out.
Yeah. Yeah. So I had a few things I wrote down of like possible missteps where I'm like could have done this better, or I'm not sure if this worked. I already mentioned that I wasn't sure if the cold open strategy of the opening was quite as clear as it could have been. I felt like not characterizing the doctor at all was kind of a missed opportunity.
I thought it was. I mean, I imagined him as just being kind of like a cold, logical doctor character that is kind of a
Yeah.
a standard doctor character who isn't really thinking, or a scientific character who doesn't really care about the ethical implications. He's just like, this is the thing, and this is how the thing works, in very realistic tones, not judging.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
so I think he worked as a character. And I don't think every character in every scene needs to have like a backstory.
Yeah, and I mean
You
that's
know.
that's I'm not going to claim that I was doing this intentionally here, but like one cool thing about writing in general is that if you leave negative space, as it were, like your reader will fill it in with something plausible. So
Right.
you
Yeah.
you don't need to like over explain a character. You just kind of draw enough
Right.
lines that the reader can infer what is supposed to be there.
Yeah, that's a good point. And sometimes when you're writing something, especially if you're writing science fiction, by the way, um, like you notice things that don't quite make sense, and you kind of obsess about making everything make sense. But sometimes it's better to just not try to explain whole bits, and leave that, and just make it seem believable through what happens, and then make the reader kind of imagine something, because that is more believable than trying to explain something that doesn't quite work.
Yeah, I agree. Um, yeah, I guess the only other like criticisms of my own story were like some of the stuff felt a bit too on the nose or like too exposition-y, like specifically the line which is just Megan didn't listen. I was like, I don't think I need like I don't need I think I was overstating the point. I think you already get it. Um,
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the subtle point at the end, it's not even that subtle, like without saying that, is just like, well, she didn't learn her lesson. And
yeah,
that's kind of I think that comes across without having to say it. Yeah.
yeah, and I guess yeah, the very last thing is like, um, and this is fully kind of I kind of forgive myself for this because of the limitations of the format, but I'm not particularly proud of any of the word choices or like the use of language in this story. I had in mind what I wanted to write, and I just kind of hammered it out as quickly as
Oh yeah.
possible.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I felt this. I felt the same way
yeah, I mean, so,
in,
see,
in my own story.
yeah, see, I felt like your story had some more nuanced word choices, whereas when I was like when I read through mine, I was like, yeah, this is just the most like perfunctory. Yeah, I mean, so I'm
Well,
go ahead.
yeah. No, I think I didn't notice your word choice as being bad.
Okay.
Although, like we both said before, we shouldn't apologize or anything for that, because the writing, I mean, we have 30 minutes, so we're not going to go make every word perfect. But I think one thing that you did here, and that you I think you tend to do in a lot of your stories, which works well, is you tell a lot of it through the dialogue.
Hmm.
So the word choices don't have to be beautiful. They just have to be how the character would say things.
Hmm.
And I definitely got a strong sense of character from Megan and Natasha through just what they said. Like everything they said was either kind of explicitly stating their, like, Natasha's disapproval or whatever, or was said in, or Megan's statements were like concise and blunt, in a way that characterizes her as a blunt, like straightforward person who doesn't think about things too deeply.
Yeah, that I appreciate that observation because I think that's true, and that's kind of a preferred style of mine. Yeah, cool. Yeah, so overall, would you say you were happy with how your story came out?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I liked the general idea, and I liked some of the elements that emerged. I like kind of the feeling of it. In terms of the language, I would want to go back and clean things up a little bit. Um, but and I think it ended at a decent spot. I don't know if there's anywhere else I would take this story. I think I just kind of communicated like a vision of a weird future world where things have gone out of hand.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I was impressed with yours because you had like something you were trying to say with the story,
yeah,
and you never really say it explicitly, but it still comes across completely for me.
right.
Which normal like I see that as a very literary thing to do. And I was happy with mine too. But mine is more of a like narrative, almost like entertainment before substance, perhaps. And I'm
It's
not.
it's like a scene from a movie or a story
Yeah, yeah.
or something.
Yeah, yeah, I was happy with mine. You know, I was thinking like the way I really know that I'm really happy with the story is that I'll be like, oh, I want to like continue this, and
Hmm.
I don't actually have that feeling with this story. So I don't know if that means anything in particular. Um,
Yeah, sometimes there's just you've said what you need to say about it,
mhm.
and yeah, I was pleased that mine kind of ended up having a relevant, I guess, message,
Hmm.
like you pointed out. Um, yeah, I felt like it was trying to say something. Um, I liked yours too as just a really short, like here's some characters, and it's kind of a complete story because there's like this the setup and then the fight and then the end is that like it kind of she didn't learn anything, and um, it's kind of the complete story of Megan. Like you get the impression that she doesn't really go anywhere else.
Hmm.
Like
Right.
she loses a lot of fights that she thinks she's gonna win, and
Yeah. Right. Like you're definitely not supposed to walk away with the impression that like she's going to be a
right,
champion someday. Like she has completely
yeah.
the wrong mentality
I,
about things.
I like just kind of imagining that instead of like I guess I don't really want to read more about her exploits
Yeah.
because I feel like she's doomed to mediocrity,
Yeah.
which is a cool thing.
Yeah, right. Good kind of character. I think I've broken my habit from a long time ago of wanting to make all of my characters like succeed. I've learned that it's way more
Yeah,
fun
yeah,
if you make them suffer.
right. Oh yeah, no, yeah. The characters should be flawed,
Yeah. So
super flawed.
so we got two submissions in the subreddit, like we said, and we're not going to read them out loud. First of all, we didn't ask permission to do that, and I would feel kind of awkward just doing that without permission. But also, I don't think we have time to read everyone's stories. But I would like to talk about them a little bit. So the first one is from Funky TK on Reddit, and so I'm just going to kind of give some impressions. This user goes with. It's kind of clear that they took the employee word kind of in the same bent that you did, where the main character is an employee who in this case doesn't have a name but has a number, and is actually kind of like doing rote work, kind of by the clock, minute by minute. So those elements are there, and this character passes through this door, and essentially, I mean, you get the sense it's a metaphorical story where they see an opportunity to have a different life, and they kind of vacillate on the question, and then I think it's implied that they decide to leave that life, but it's told in a very interesting kind of almost dreamlike tone. So,
Yeah,
yeah, do you feel that?
uh, yeah, yeah. It's kind of like Well, he mentions he was inspired by the Stanley Parable. Are you aware of that?
No, I'm not sure. I don't know what that is.
That's a indie video game, which is very I don't even know how to describe it. It's very odd. It's very artistic,
Okay.
but it's more of like a storytelling thing than a an abstract storytelling thing, kind of, rather than gameplay.
Cool.
And and yeah, it's a cool little story. I kind of get the impression that the employee decides not to leave, and
Okay.
he doesn't want to leave his cozy office, even though it's boring and mundane. It's safer. He doesn't want to go out into the scary world with its sunlight and grass.
Okay. See,
So it's a good ambiguous ending.
yeah, I read the use of the Patrick rather than the number to mean that he had changed his
Oh,
mind.
that's a good point. I didn't even put that together, but
Yeah, but
yeah.
I mean, I like ambiguous endings too, so I'll go with that. Okay, cool. Yeah. So the
The
other,
second
yeah,
the second story kind of went along your lines with the gland that takes over someone in a terrifying way.
hmm
Um, yeah, actually, like a lot of the story is a kind of frantic description of the like tentacles and stuff coming out of the organ and the person being really freaked out, and it's quite creepy in an effective way. And then it's kind of revealed at the end that it was like a side effect and like a dream.
yeah. It's interesting because like I like the fact that we're asking people to not only write their story but kind of talk about it a little bit because it kind of turned out that the story kind of did exactly what the author intended it to because the story does indeed create this kind of like this it communicates this like anxiety and tension and uncertainty about what's going on
Right.
because like sometimes you're tempted to be like this is I'm not clear on what's going on, therefore this is bad writing. But in this case, it's like no, it's intentional, like it's intentionally throwing these elements at you that is not explaining. It's explaining
Right.
just enough to give you creepy imagery and a sense of like suffering and pain and fear.
Right. Yeah. A
Which
good
is
way to communicate that like terror is yeah, by making it not exactly clear
yeah,
what's happening.
yeah, right. Yeah, so I thought this was really interesting. I think
It's awesome that people wrote these, and this hasn't even come out yet. I think I told you over a text message that I'm surprised that like anyone participates in things that aren't for grades as an educator.
yeah.
So it was really cool that other people besides us, thought this kind of thing would be fun.
Yeah, this to me, like this exercise sounds fun. There's, you know, there's a subreddit called Writing Prompts, which is kind of different, where like people will just post like a writing prompt and then everyone will comment with a story.
Oh,
And
interesting.
it's fun. I'd like to visit it, and I've posted there a few times, but I always kind of feel like I'm like casting something into the void that's not really being like at most you'll get a few upvotes, and you're like it's not that I demand appreciation. It's that I like to feel like something has been learned or accomplished by my writing it. So
Right.
so this thing where we analyze it and we kind of discuss what it was doing, rather than just saying like, oh, that was pretty good job. I find way more value in what we're trying to do here. So hopefully other people share that perspective.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we'll get to discuss it, and one
Yeah,
of our favorite things is to discuss
yeah,
how stories work.
yeah. That's right. Yeah. All right. Did you have any more comments this week, Michael?
No, I'm excited about the next week.
Yeah. All right. Well, that wraps up our show. Michael, let's spin the wheel and find out what our words for next week's story are going to be.
All right. The words are election, hoe, HOE, and value.
Cool.
Election, hoe, and value. Interesting. My mind is already going places.
Yeah, me too. It's magical. Yeah, so everybody, you can post your own story submissions to reddit.com/r/so-called writers, and we'll probably try to figure out something more creative than just kind of glossing over and discussing them. But we will certainly read them and give you feedback of some kind. And really excited to see where this goes. Talk to you all next week.